You are going to die. Not today, maybe not this year, but the version of you that exists right now. Soft, distracted, addicted to comfort, terrified of silence. That version is already dying. And the only question left is whether you let it die on your terms, or whether life rips it away from you in a moment of crisis, when you have no strength left to survive the loss. Because here is the brutal truth. Nobody wants to whisper into your ear at 3 in the morning, when you are scrolling through a phone screen, looking for meaning in memes and validation in likes. The ancient Stoics, men who buried their children, who were exiled from their homelands, who watched empires burn, and still woke up the next morning to write, to think, to act. These men did not build their calm from comfort. They built it from catastrophe, and if you think for 1 second that Marcus Aurelius sat on the throne of Rome feeling powerful and secure, you are wrong, because the man wrote his private journal, the words we now call meditations, not as a victory lap, but as a desperate nightly discipline to stop himself from collapsing under the weight of plague, war, betrayal, and grief. And if an emperor of Rome needed brutal rules to survive his own mind, what makes you think you can scroll your way to peace? What makes you think motivation quotes and 5-minute breathing exercises will save you from the storm that is coming? Because it is coming. It always comes, and when it arrives, comfort will not save you. Only steel will, and today, right now, in the next few minutes, I am going to hand you the first of 7 brutal Stoic rules that ancient philosophers used to rebuild broken men into unshakable ones. Rules so uncomfortable that most people hear them once and run back to their weakness, because the truth is heavier than the lie. But if you stay, if you actually let this sink into your bones, instead of just your ears, something in you is going to shift. And by the time we reach Rule 7, the person reading this will not be the same person who started it. So let's begin where every Stoic transformation begins. Not with hope, not with positivity, but with acceptance of pain as fuel. Rule number 1 is this: stop asking why bad things happen to you, and start asking what they are here to build in you. Because the Stoics did not see suffering as an enemy to be avoided at all costs. They saw it as raw material, the same way a blacksmith sees fire not as destruction, but as the very thing that shapes the blade. And Epictetus, a man who spent years of his life as a slave, whose leg was reportedly broken by a master who saw him as nothing more than property, did not walk away from that suffering broken. He walked away with a philosophy so powerful that free men and emperors would study his words centuries later, because Epictetus understood something most people spend their entire lives refusing to accept. The event itself is neutral. It is your reaction that turns it into a weapon against you, or a tool for you. And when you finally understand this, when it stops being a nice quote you nod at and becomes a lens you actually see your life through, you realize that the job loss, the breakup, the betrayal, the diagnosis, the humiliation, none of it was ever the real enemy. The real enemy was always the story you told yourself about what it meant. And here is where it gets brutal, because most people are not ready to hear this next part. Your pain is not special. Your suffering is not unique. And the sooner you stop treating your wound as a monument you visit daily for sympathy, the sooner you can start treating it as a forge. And this is not about suppressing emotion. This is not about pretending you feel nothing, because the Stoics were not emotionless robots. Seneca wept. Marcus Aurelius grieved his children. These were men who felt deeply. But they refused to let feeling become identity. They refused to let a temporary storm convince them they were permanently broken. And that distinction is the difference between someone who survives hardship and someone who is consumed by it forever. So ask yourself honestly right now, in this very moment, what pain are you still carrying as an identity instead of as a lesson? What wound have you built a shrine around instead of a blade from? Because until you answer that question honestly, every other rule I give you in this series will bounce off you like rain on stone. So sit with it. Let it sting a little. Because growth that doesn't sting isn't growth. It's just another comfortable lie you're telling yourself to avoid the fire that could actually forge you into something unbreakable. And if you think this first rule was uncomfortable, wait until you hear what's coming next. Because rule number 2 is going to challenge something even deeper than your relationship with pain. It's going to challenge your relationship with control itself. And most people, if they're honest, have absolutely no idea how much of their daily suffering comes from trying to control things that were never theirs to control in the first place. So stay with me, because this next rule is where the real transformation begins. And once you understand it, you will never look at your anxiety, your anger, or your fear the same way again. Rule number 2 is the one that will expose exactly how much of your daily suffering you manufactured yourself, with your own hands, out of your own obsession with controlling things that were never yours to control. And I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment because it sounds simple, but it is one of the most violent truths in all of Stoic philosophy. Epictetus opened his entire handbook, the Enchiridion, with this single idea, because he understood that everything else in the philosophy collapses if you don't grasp this first. Some things are up to you, and some things are not, and almost every ounce of anxiety, rage, jealousy, and despair that has ever gutted you came from confusing the two, came from you standing at the edge of a storm you cannot control. Other people's opinions, the economy, your genetics, the past, the actions of people who betrayed you, the outcome of an interview, the diagnosis on a chart, the verdict of a jury, the algorithm that decides who sees your work, and pouring your entire soul into trying to command it like a king commanding weather. And every single time, without exception, the storm ignores you, because it was never listening, it was never yours. And you walk away from that battle feeling powerless, feeling cursed, feeling like life is against you, when in reality you were the one who declared war on a thing you were never meant to fight in the first place. And here is where it gets brutal, because most self-help content will tell you to focus on what you can control, as some kind of gentle, comfortable, Pinterest quote advice. But the Stoics meant something far more savage than that. They meant you must be willing to lose everything external, your reputation, your possessions, your health, even your life, and still remain untouched at the core. Because the only things that are truly, completely, unshakably yours are your judgments, your choices, your effort, and your character. And everything else, every single other thing you have ever cried over, lost sleep over, begged the universe over, was borrowed, was temporary, was never actually under your command. And Marcus Aurelius, ruling the most powerful empire on earth, a man who could execute enemies and command armies, wrote to himself that even he did not have control over whether the barbarians would breach the border, whether the plague would take another child from Rome, whether the Senate would conspire against him. The most powerful man alive still had to draw the same brutal line that you, sitting there right now with far less power than an emperor, refuse to draw. And that is the real prison. Not the outside world, not your circumstances, but the invisible bars you built by insisting on controlling what was never in your hands. And I want you to think right now, honestly, about the thing that has been eating you alive lately. The relationship you can't fix, because the other person won't change. The job you can't secure, because the decision belongs to someone else. The health scare you can't undo, because the past cannot be rewritten. And I want you to ask yourself, brutally, without flinching, how much of my suffering right now is coming from refusing to accept that this was never mine to control, and how much energy have I burned trying to force an outcome that was always going to be decided by forces outside myself? Because here is the freedom hidden inside this brutal rule. The moment you stop trying to control the storm, you get all of that stolen energy back, and you get to redirect it into the only place it was ever useful: your own response, your own discipline, your own next action. And this is not passivity. This is not giving up. This is the opposite of giving up. Because the Stoics were not men who sat back and let life happen to them. Cato stood against Caesar, knowing he could not control the outcome of Rome's collapse. But he controlled how he faced it, with his dignity intact until his very last breath. And that is the model: not surrender to fate, but total, ruthless focus on what remains yours no matter what fate decides. And once this rule actually settles into your bones, something strange happens. The fear of failure starts to lose its grip, because you realize failure of outcome was never fully yours to prevent in the first place. Only your effort was yours. Only your integrity in the attempt was yours. And when you stop measuring your worth by outcomes you never controlled and start measuring it by the discipline you brought to the moment, you become almost impossible to break, because nothing external can touch the one thing you've now fully claimed as your own. But be warned. This rule is also the most dangerous one to misunderstand, because if you use it as an excuse to stop trying, to stop caring, to disengage from responsibility and call it Stoicism, you have missed the entire point and built yourself a new prison disguised as freedom. And that brings us to rule number 3, a rule that most people who half understand Stoicism get completely wrong. A rule about desire itself, about the difference between wanting nothing and wanting the right things in the right way. And once you hear it, you will understand why so many people who claim to be detached and unbothered are actually just numb, and why real Stoic discipline demands something far harder than simply not caring. Rule number 3 is the one that separates real Stoics from the fake ones flooding your social media feed with quotes about not caring and staying unbothered. Because there is a poison spreading through modern self-help culture disguised as ancient wisdom. A poison that tells you the path to peace is to want nothing, feel nothing, expect nothing, and protect yourself from disappointment by simply refusing to care about outcomes at all. And I need you to understand right now, before you go one more day carrying this lie, that this is not Stoicism. This is emotional cowardice wearing a toga, and the actual philosophers who built this discipline would have looked at that kind of numbness with disgust. Because Epictetus did not teach his students to want nothing. He taught them to want correctly. And there is a canyon of difference between the two, because desire itself was never the enemy in Stoic philosophy. The enemy was always desiring things outside your control while treating them as though your peace depended on getting them. And this is the brutal nuance that almost nobody online bothers to explain, because it does not fit in a 15-second clip. So let me give it to you properly, the way it was actually meant to be understood. The Stoics divided desire into 2 categories: the desire for externals, wealth, romantic love returned exactly the way you want it, promotions, admiration, a body that never ages, a life free of loss, and the desire for internals, your own virtue, your own discipline, your own integrity of action. And here is the brutal part: the part that will sting if you actually let it land every time you have ever felt crushed, devastated, hollowed out by disappointment. It was because you had quietly, without even noticing, staked your peace on an external outcome instead of your own conduct. You wanted the relationship to work, and when it didn't, you didn't just lose the relationship, you lost your sense of self along with it. You wanted the promotion, and when someone else got it, you didn't just lose a title, you lost your sense of worth along with it. And this is the trap. This is the prison Rule 2 already warned you about, but Rule 3 goes deeper, because it shows you what to do instead, not just what to release your grip on. And the answer the Stoics gave, the answer Marcus Aurelius repeated to himself constantly in the middle of war and plague and betrayal, was this: desire only what is truly yours to achieve, your own effort, your own honesty, your own discipline in the face of chaos, and treat everything else, every external outcome, as something you would prefer to happen, but do not need to happen in order to remain whole. And this is called preferred indifference. In the old texts, a term that sounds cold on paper, but is actually one of the most liberating ideas ever developed by the human mind, because it means you are allowed to want the job, the relationship, the recognition, the health, the money. You are allowed to pursue all of it with full effort and full ambition. But the moment it slips through your fingers despite your best effort, you do not collapse, because your identity was never fused to the outcome in the first place. It was fused only to the quality of your pursuit. And this is why numbness is not peace, because a numb man does not pursue anything. A numb man protects himself by wanting nothing, so he can never be disappointed. But that is not strength. That is surrender disguised as wisdom, whereas a true Stoic pursues everything with full intensity and still walks away steady when the world says no, because his foundation was never built on the answer. It was built on the asking, on the discipline of trying, on the integrity of the attempt. And this is the difference between the men who quote Stoicism on the internet while secretly being terrified of trying anything in case they fail, and the actual Stoics who ran for public office, who commanded armies, who built businesses and families and legacies, all while knowing full well that any of it could be taken from them tomorrow. And the proof of this is written directly into the life of Seneca, a man who accumulated enormous wealth as an advisor to emperors, who lived in genuine luxury, and who was later ordered to end his own life by the very emperor he had once tutored. And when that order came, Seneca did not fall apart clutching at the wealth and status he was losing, because he had always held it the way you hold water in an open palm, present, useful, enjoyed, but never gripped so tightly that its loss would drown him. And that is the entire lesson of Rule 3. Hold your ambitions in an open palm, pursue them with everything you have, and refuse to let your grip tighten into desperation. Because desperation is not passion. Desperation is fear wearing passion's clothing. And once you learn to want things the Stoic way, fully engaged but never enslaved, you stop being a man who is terrified of trying and become a man who tries at everything precisely because he no longer fears the outcome. And this brings us to a darker, heavier rule, one that most people cannot even bring themselves to think about without flinching, because rule number 4 is not about desire or control at all. It is about the one thing every human being spends their entire life running from: avoiding, denying, distracting themselves from with noise and screens and busy work. And the Stoics did not run from it. They trained with it daily. They invited it into their morning meditations on purpose, because they understood something that will either terrify you or free you, depending on how ready you are to hear it. The only way to truly live without fear is to make peace with the one certainty none of us can escape. Rule number 4 is the one people avoid the longest, the one that makes grown men change the subject and scroll past the video, because it forces you to look directly at the thing every human being spends their entire life sprinting away from with noise. Work, distraction, and noise again. And that thing is death, your death, not death as an abstract concept that happens to other people in obituaries you skim past, but your actual, specific, unavoidable death, the one waiting somewhere on a calendar you cannot see. And here is the brutal twist the Stoics discovered thousands of years before modern psychology caught up to them. The people who think about death the most are not the most anxious people alive. They are the calmest, because Marcus Aurelius did not avoid the topic of his own mortality. He opened his private journal with it again and again, reminding himself every single morning that he could lose his life before the sun went down, not as a morbid obsession, but as a filtering system, a way to instantly separate what actually mattered from what was cheap noise pretending to be important. And this practice had a name: Memento Mori, remember you must die. And it was not a slogan for gloomy poets. It was a daily tool used by soldiers, emperors, and slaves alike to strip away the fake urgency of ego, status, and grudges. Because when you actually sit with the fact that your time is finite and unscheduled, certain things instantly lose their grip on you. The argument you've been replaying in your head for 3 days suddenly feels absurd. The grudge you've been feeding for years suddenly feels like a waste of the only currency you actually have, which is time, and the fear of what other people think of you. The fear that has quietly steered half the decisions of your life suddenly shrinks down to its true size, which is almost nothing, because a dying man does not care about the opinion of strangers on a screen. And here is the part that will genuinely disturb you if you let it. You are that dying man, right now, today. You simply have the luxury of not knowing the date. And most people use that uncertainty as an excuse to sleepwalk through their entire existence, assuming there will always be more time to say the important thing, to forgive the person, to chase the goal, to become who they actually wanted to be. And then one day there isn't more time, and the Stoics refuse to gamble on that assumption, which is exactly why Seneca wrote one of his most savage lines, warning that it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a great deal of it. That life is long enough if you actually spend it, instead of leaking it away through distraction, resentment, and fear. And this is where Rule 4 connects back to everything you've already learned in this series. Because once you accept that your time is not guaranteed, Rule 1 becomes obvious. Of course you use suffering as fuel. You don't have decades to sit around nursing wounds as identities. Rule 2 becomes obvious. Of course you stop wasting your limited days trying to control the storm. And Rule 3 becomes obvious. Of course you pursue your ambitions with your whole chest, instead of guarding yourself from disappointment. Because a man who knows he is dying does not play small, he does not hedge. He does not wait for the perfect moment that never comes. He acts now, loves now, forgives now, builds now, because now is the only guarantee he has ever actually had. And I want you to think, right now, about what you have been postponing, the conversation you keep delaying, the apology you keep swallowing, the dream you keep telling yourself you'll start next year, next month, next Monday. And I want you to feel the weight of the Stoic truth sitting underneath all of it. There may not be a next Monday. There may not be a next year. And the tragedy is not death itself. The tragedy is a person who had time and spent it pretending they had forever. And this is not meant to terrify you into paralysis. It is meant to do the exact opposite. It is meant to hand you the same clarity Marcus Aurelius carried onto the battlefield and into the plague-ridden streets of Rome. A clarity that says, because I could lose everything today, I will not waste today. I will act with the urgency of a man who understands the clock is real. And once that truth settles into your bones, fear starts to lose its power over you, because you realize the worst thing that can happen to you was always going to happen eventually, and no amount of avoidance was ever going to change that outcome. Only your relationship to it. Only how fully you lived while you had the chance. And this is the final brutal gift the Stoics left behind. 4 rules that started with pain as fuel, moved through control as freedom, passed through desire without desperation, and now arrive here, at mortality as clarity. Not 4 separate lessons, but one single architecture for an unshakable mind. A mind that has already made peace with the worst the world can offer, and therefore has nothing left to fear. And if you have made it this far, if these words actually landed somewhere real instead of bouncing off, then you already know the version of you that started this video is not the same version finishing it. And the only question left, the only one that has ever mattered, is what you are going to do with the time you have left. Because the ancient philosophers already told you the answer. They lived it. They died by it. And now it is sitting in your hands, waiting to see if you will finally pick it up. Everything you have just heard. The pain turned into fuel. The storm you stopped trying to control. The desire held in an open palm instead of a clenched fist. The death that clarifies instead of terrifies. All of it points to one final, brutal truth that the Stoics considered the seal on the entire philosophy. And it is simply this. None of these rules mean anything unless you practice them today, in this exact life, in this exact body, with the exact problems sitting in front of you right now. Because Stoicism was never meant to be a philosophy you admire from a distance. It was built by men who tested it in courtrooms, on battlefields, in exile, in grief, in the final hours before their own execution. And if you close this video and go back to the same distractions, the same grudges, the same fear of trying, the same avoidance of your own mortality, then every word here was just noise, another piece of content consumed and forgotten by tomorrow morning. And that is the one outcome the Stoics would have considered an actual tragedy. Not failure, not loss, not even death itself, but a mind that heard the truth and did nothing with it. So here is the final instruction, the only one that matters more than all 7 rules combined. Pick one rule, just one, and apply it today, before you sleep tonight, not next week. Not when things calm down, because things are never going to calm down. That was never the deal life offered you. The deal was always chaos, and your only real choice is whether you meet that chaos as the soft, distracted version of yourself from the beginning of this video, or as someone who has already started building the unshakable mind the ancients spent their entire lives pursuing. And if this actually reached you, if even one sentence in this series cracked something open in your thinking, then don't just sit with it. Act on it. Share it with someone who needs to hear it as badly as you did, and come back. Because the next chapter of this discipline is waiting, and the version of you that keeps showing up to build this mind, body, and heart is the only version that was ever going to make it through what's coming next.